welcome then everyone here to the meeting tonight. This is a joint meeting that's been organised between Tower Hamlets, Unison and Bookmarks Bookshop. And the meeting tonight is really a celebration of Elenor Marx and the tradition of radical women and men in the East End. My name is Andrea. I work in Bookmarks Bookshop and I will introduce the other speakers who we've got here in a minute. This is sort of an official launch for us of the new Rebels Guide, which is this one here, which is the Rebels Guide to Elenor Marx. And it's been published now, and it's the last one in a series of 7 books we have, including Karl Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Gramsci, Rebels Guide to Sexism. They're all at the back on the bookstall for a bargain, £3 each. And this Rebels Guide series has been going now since 2006, and they're designed to be very short and accessible introductions to sort of key political thinkers and ideas. And they're small books that are full of very, very big ideas, and they focus on the vibrancy of the figures that they're writing about and the relevance of those ideas for us all today. And I think that's what Siobhan has managed to do so well with the latest book in this series on Elenor. So the 3 speakers that we have tonight, we've got Siobhan, who wrote the Rebels Guide to Elenor Marx, and she's been very busy over the last few weeks, crisscrossing the country, speaking at meetings, especially around International Women's Day. Siobhan has a very long association with Bookmarks Bookshop as well, and she's worked with us in the past. And we're all really, really pleased to see her now as a new young author, and we're very proud that we all know her and that we've worked with her for such a long time. Next to Siobhan, I have Louise Raw. Louise is the author of one of the biggest selling books that we have in our bookshop over a long period, called Striking a Light, which is about the Matchwomen strike of 1888. She's a historian, she's a writer, she's a speaker, and she's the acknowledged expert, I think, authority on the Matchwomen strike. And really the research that Louise has done has really changed our idea of that part of British Labour history. Something that in the past has been misinterpreted and neglected by historians. And the true story that Louise tells is really quite wild and wonderful, and it's far more interesting and colourful than we would have been led to believe. Louise has spoken, to academic audiences in France and Sweden and Germany, as well as the UK. She's appeared on TV shows. You might have seen her, like the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are, where she appeared with Barbara Windsor, and The Worst Jobs in History with Tony Robinson. And Louise writes a regular column for the Morning Star as well. But then our first speaker tonight, on the end here, is Glyn Robbins. And Glyn is a local trade unionist, a local housing worker, and he's also the local Tusk candidate for this area. And he also has some local connections with the stories that Siobhan and Louise are going to talk about later. So Glyn's going to talk for about 5 minutes, but then he has childcare responsibilities tonight. So Glyn apologises, but he's going to have to leave straight after he's spoken. And then Louise and Siobhan will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes each, and we'll open it up for discussion. So if you could just join me in welcoming all our speakers tonight.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to make 3, I hope interrelated but potentially confused points, and then leave. Right? Apologies for that. So, first about Elenor Marx, who I sort of met many, many years ago. I bought this book when the New Parent Centre was still in Green Street, another great institution about to leave Green Street, unfortunately, i.e. West Ham, but that's a different subject. And I noticed my copy of this book is falling apart, but fortunately, still intact on page 196, I found this as I was leafing through it. You might need to change some of the words to make some sense of why I'm reading this extract. Obviously, Elenor Marx spent a great deal of time, I'm sure she will talk about this, in this area. And the author, Yvonne Kapp, describes how the importance of these East End radical clubs, which covered the boroughs from Poplar and Hackney, Bermondsey and Stepney, as far west as Islington and Finsbury, with their local federations, lay in that they drew together politically conscious working men and women who voted Liberal for want of an alternative to the Tories. Thus they were fertile soil for implanting the notion of an independent workers' party. That was in the 1880s and 1890s, and I think, as I say, if you change some of the titles there, you might see that the work that Elenor Marx was doing back then is relevant to what we're doing in Tower Hamlets today. Second, about the Matchwomen's strike. I've already confessed to Louise that I haven't read the book yet.
I have shame.
Well, which of course I will do.
It's at the back.
It's at the back.
Signed
In all
copies
good
available.
bookshops. But I do have, well, two personal associations Andrea alluded to. My nan worked in the factory. She didn't talk very much about that experience. I think for her, as for many other working class women living in this area, it was a place to work, and not one that she necessarily looked back on with that much fondness. But I also worked there, and this is another confession. I was in my callow youth, I worked in a demolition crew that went into the Bryant factory to demolish it, essentially, or gut it from the inside in order to make it fit for habitation, but as luxury flats, as I'm sure everybody is aware what has become of the so-called Bow Quarter. And people may know that I have an association with housing and housing issues, and obviously the point there is very clear, not just about the over-provision of a certain type of housing in this borough and elsewhere in London, but also I think about the desecration of our history. I'm not saying we should necessarily have kept the factory open as a museum, although actually there are worse ideas. But to see something that has that significance and importance for local history effectively become a gated community, and much worse than that, one that during the Olympics had weapons of mass destruction put on the roof, was, I think, a real, as I say, desecration of our local history, and something that we need to be conscious of. I mean, not in the sense of preserving these things as in aspect, but being aware of that history that we have in the East End. And you know, I just come back from earlier speaking for another 5 minutes at an RMT meeting. And you know, I know no one in this room needs to be reminded of this really, but we are in danger, I suppose, of taking for granted some of the huge advances that have been won over the last 100 years or so. You know, notably by those pioneers at the Great Dock Strike, but also the Matchwomen's strike, and I'm sure Louise will say a lot more about that. But my third slightly random point, I suppose, relates more specifically in trying to atone for my previous sins, smashing up the Bryant factory. And by the way, it is true, not necessarily something I want widely publicised, but you know, you do these things sometimes. But obviously I'm now find myself in the slightly unexpected position of standing for Parliament. I'm not sure what my nan would have said about that, but one of the issues, it's been very interesting even within the couple of weeks that I've been doing this, to get quite a lot of letters from people. This is obviously a new kind of phenomenon, certainly new to me anyway. And they come as a sort of form of stop letters, so you get, well, what are you going to do about the NHS? What do you think about disarmament? What's your position on Palestine? And I'm getting them, you know, on a daily basis. And I've had several, I can't remember exactly, I should do the stats. What's your position on sexism? And then there's a list of questions, and I've answered them as best I can. But one of the things I've said, and I'm putting this out there as a suggestion really, something I've been thinking about for a long time and never really got round to do anything about, and maybe this is an opportunity to do something about, is the whole question of domestic violence, which I know is not specific to this meeting as such, although it is in a way. But I think Domestic Violence Consciousness Week is approaching. And my idea is that to address the problem that most people who work in this field and are far more knowledgeable than I am about it refer to, which is that this is a hidden crime. You know, this is a national scandal. It's going on day after day. 2 women a week killed by their current or former partners. And I always think, well, imagine if it was the other way around. Not that it would make it any better, but imagine if 2 men a week were being killed by their partners. You know, there would be a national outrage, and yet this happens. And my idea, and the suggestion I've made, some of the people who've written to me, is that when we were in the illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, the media went to a lot of trouble to constantly remind us about how many soldiers have been killed. Quite rightly, in my opinion, leaving aside the illegality of the wars. And if you go to the States, they're still doing it. And they make quite a play of it. And I think it's to try and humanise the, as it were, military victims. And so they say a little bit about the soldiers, where they came from, whether they played sport, what their hobbies were, that kind of thing. And I wonder whether if we built a campaign up demanding that our media outlets, the state broadcaster, the BBC, always, obviously with the family's permission, always reported when a woman had been killed, and a man for that matter, but it's far more likely to be a woman, let's be straight about it, had been killed in a domestic violence situation, whether that would begin to break the circle of violence that is taking place around us. So that's something that I'm considering adding to my manifesto. If you want to know more about what I think on these issues and others, next Tuesday we're having our first public campaign meeting. It's taking place at the Cranbrook Estate in Bethnal Green. There's flyers for that, and please take them, and hope to see you over the next weeks and afterwards. Thanks very much.
Louise now, who's going to speak first, and thank you very, very much for coming along tonight, Lynn. And no, we understand you have to go. And then after Louise, we'll have Siobhan. Just to let you know, I'm not sitting here texting, I am tweeting, because there's a lot of people who follow the bookshop on Twitter and want to follow the meeting as well. So as well as being filmed, I do a bit of tweeting while we're going on. So I'm not sitting here being rude. So
She's playing Candy Crush, don't you?
It's you that keeps inviting me.
Glyn, can I just suggest, have you linked up with groups like Counting Dead Women and the March Dead Women?
No, but
they're really good.
Yeah,
if you contact me, they're very, very good, and they do exactly, they're aiming to do exactly what you want us to, so that's great. Yeah, it's funny, when the Bow Quarter was turned into luxury accommodation from the Match Factory, they were going to have a statue to commemorate the fact that it was a Match Factory. And they apparently had a competition, and a local artist won the competition, but then the property company decided it wasn't really very sort of image they wanted to go for, all these sort of working class women. So instead, there's nothing, there's a plaque on the wall, but there's very little to memorialise the Matchwomen at all, and the blocks are called things like Manhattan and Staten Island, and it's all totally Americanised and yuppified. It really is a great shame, but it does make me laugh that people are now trying to get into the Bow Quarter when they were just desperate to get out in the days of the Matchwomen. And I think they'd have been quite happy with Glyn knocking it down, to be honest. They'd like to have raised it to the ground themselves. But if we go back a little bit to the East End of the 1880s to set the scene for you tonight, it's somewhere where, as I can see, you're all extremely respectable people. You would have been unlikely to, some of you, well, one or two of you, you would have been unlikely to have set foot, actually, in the East End of the 1880s, unless you were going slumming, which really was a thing. It really was a thing that Victorians did. They would go on tours of what they called the mysterious East and the darkest East. They really othered it. They othered it to death. With a couple of policemen, obviously, because working class people, and they would go and sort of look at the inhabitants as if they were in a zoo. The East End and EastEnders, these were really new terms, by the way. No one said that much before the 1880s, and we think it's a musical song that started this term. And it was an insult. If you called someone an EastEnder, that was fighting talk in the 1880s. And it was said that if you were from another part of London, you could just about be poor and maybe be deserving poor or respectable poor. But if you were from the East End, forget it. It was a case of, as somebody said, lock up the spoons and reach for the bug powder. So there you go. But why? Why and how did this happen? This was something that was done to the East End, actually. It had always been a centre for migration and for production and industry, surrounded on three sides by water, that's understandable. But it was the coming of the railways that really left the East End on its own, because anybody who could got the hell out of the East End and went to live in a suburb and would commute to work in London. They just left the East Enders to get on with it. They left the poorest, least, people with the least resources, infrastructure all but collapsed, and the middle upper classes just let them get on with it, really. And it was said that at this period, most upper and middle class Londoners, even if they lived quite nearby, couldn't point to the East End on a map. They completely, this sort of class, it had been cut off, cut adrift from the rest of London. It's quite astonishing. And what was left behind, one writer said, was a hell of poverty. And it really was. What did the middle upper classes do about this? Well, obviously they blamed the poor for being poor. This is something, if you read the Daily Mail, you might be familiar with this view. The Daily Mail established around this time, actually, and hasn't seen any need to change its line on class or gender ever since. Stick with the winning system. So, blame the poor, it's their fault, they choose to live, they're very strange, the poor, they choose to live 10 to a room. It's like a funny little habit they have. Obviously they could live in a big townhouse, but no, they like it, like that. The worst of the poor, even in the East End, were the Irish, of course. Very, very, very bad thing to be Irish at this point. Because they were migrants, of course they had to take the worst accommodation. You're fleeing famine or persecution in Ireland, you haven't got any resources, you come over here, you're forced to live in even worse conditions. And what do the English say? Well, look at them. They're living 20 to a room. This is just bizarre. This is what these Irish people do. And there was one part of the East End called the Fenian Barracks, because so many Irish people lived in it. And it was said of this area, men are not human, they are wild beasts, which is really charming. And this is really honestly what people thought about this underclass, not just the Irish. They're almost feral, they're not really human, so that's okay then, isn't it? Inequality is all right, they like it like that, it's fine, they haven't got to feel bad about it. Unless something happens like a cholera outbreak. Now, unfortunately, outrageously, infectious diseases do not respect class boundaries. Who knew? And occasionally the middle upper classes sort of have to care a bit more. Missions are established, people go into the East End to do good works and to study the poor. What are we going to do about these people? What are we going to do about this underclass? Not just the East End, but this is happening all over England. Victorians, they love their sciences, they love their pseudosciences, they sort of study the poor and pretty much measure them, actually. You have people like Charles Booth going into the East End, expecting to find that the claims of poverty are really exaggerated, because he's quite posh, is Charles Booth. And instead, he finds when he's doing his poverty maps that things are actually worse, far, far worse than the media is reporting. So they look at the working classes and they're appalled by what they see. They see degeneration, and the Victorians are huge on eugenics. They love a bit of eugenics. There's horrible pseudoscience. We know where it ended in Nazi Germany. But on the left and the right, people were, really passionate about eugenics. So the poor are degenerating the race. They're pulling us all down. Not because they're poor. This couldn't happen to us. We are middle class, we're upper class. Even if we lived in those circumstances, we wouldn't live like that. We would better ourselves, of course, but they're innately bad. They're innately flawed people. So again, isn't that great? We haven't got to really worry about it, have we? Except when we have wars and the working class specimens aren't very good for soldiering. That's a bit of a problem. So perhaps we do need to look at it. What are we going to do about all these people and all these working people that we can now see with industrialisation? They're not quietly starving in the countryside anymore. That was okay. Instead, they're on our city streets. What are we going to do about this? So what everyone gets behind at this point is the idea of a woman's place being in the home, and of getting working class women, ending working class women, really, getting them all back to the home. Everything will be all right if you can stop working class women from working, obviously, because they will do loads of housework with their no money, because they'll have even less because they're not working, and with their no running water, they will make a lovely home, and no national health service and no benefits. They will do much better jobs if you deprive them of their wages. Male trade unionists, not always, but sometimes get behind this because they're promised the mythical breadwinner wage, a thing which never existed, never has happened, but which is always dangled out like a carrot. If you come with us and encourage women to go back to the home, respectable women don't work. And the people saying that respectable women don't work, amongst these people are factory owners, so they're going to work, benefiting from women's labour, making profits from it, and then going home and saying, but respectable women don't work, of course. My wives, my daughters are far too good to do this. It's only the worst kind of women who work. And actually, there's a real illusion between working girls and prostitutes at this time. The other thing that Victorians absolutely put the wind up Victorians, enthusiastic users of the service, but also very critical and condemnatory of prostitutes, who are, of course, prostituting because they want to and because they're bad, and because they want to lure decent middle-class and upper-class men who are just trying to get home to their wives. Leave me alone, Elsie. And they're dragging them, they're lassoing them, and dragging them into the streets of the East End to infect them with diseases, because obviously the working-class women give themselves venereal diseases, like toilet seats or something, I don't know, it's never really specified, but it's their fault. They're really nasty pieces of work. Give them, get them back to the home, have them cleaning the white lead in their doorsteps, and it'll all be fine. Now, the Matchwomen are on every count, I'm afraid, the worst kind of women, even in the worst part of London. They are once, twice, three times not ladies. They are Irish, they're working class, and they're working women, and they're EastEnders as well, and they're really taking the mickey here, aren't they? No wonder people thought they were pretty appalling. And they were infamous before their strike in 1888. People would try to rush off the streets before the Matchwomen finished their shifts, because, you know, there would be language and carrying on, and they would walk arm in arm down the Bow Road, they would be cheeky to passers-by. This was all terrible. People would sort of scuttle inside and pull their children indoors before the Matchwomen came off shift. Even the way they dressed was all wrong. They didn't dress in a modest way, as, you know, working class women, preferably don't be seen, don't be heard, beige if you must go out in public at all, beige clothing. But they knew this, and what's interesting, like a lot of working class women before and since, their appearance was a real badge of pride to them, a bit of glamour, a bit of Victorian bling, was very, very defiant actually, and they knew it was disapproved of, and there must have been mass tutting when they strode down the streets in their best clothes. Also, the wrong kind of hats on the wrong kinds of heads, I'm afraid to tell you. They would join together into feather clubs, and they would pay a little bit from their wages, and then somebody, when there was enough money, would go and buy a communal hat, which you would then share. So if you had a date with the docker, you get the hat, bring it back in one piece, and so on. So they, you know, this was a real badge of identity. They had the strongest sense of identity, the Matchwomen. They all stuck up for each other. They were famous for that. They did occasionally have punch-ups. That was how they settled disputes. Didn't have trade unions, so you know. But they generally were known for getting on really well and really standing out for each other. Even their critics admit that. So in July 1888, what happens? They just casually walk out on strike and start the modern trade union movement, as you do, of a morning. They've had enough of management bullying and conditions, starvation wages, and Fossy Jaw, you might have heard, if you've heard about the Matchwomen, of phosphorus necrosis, this horrendous disease, white phosphorus working its way into your jawbones, decaying your jawbones. They walk out on strike, they have no trade unions, this is really important. So, you know, what are they doing? Not only are they working class, Bryant and May are gentlemen. This is very much the tone of the news reports. And what on earth is going on here? Police leave is cancelled. They're rushed into the East End because there's a fear of social revolution too. And they're just appalled. You know, they're lucky enough to have jobs from nice Mr. Bryant and Mr. May, and they've got the temerity to walk out on strike. If a woman's place is in the home, not the factory, it's certainly not on the picket line. What is going on? This was such an important dispute. It was important because they won, and this did not happen typically. There have always been strikes. It's not the first strike of women by any means, but it was successful. Now, no one really expected that. I don't know if they expected that. Bryant and May were so in with government. They were so well connected, and they had huge country estates, and they were sheriff of this and sheriff of that. Not Nottingham. It should have been Nottingham, really. No one expected this, but with the help of publicity and right place, right time, marching to Parliament, meeting with MPs, they turned the tide on Bryant and May, and it became embarrassing to be a Bryant and May shareholder, people desperately selling shares, and Liberal MPs and clergymen were big shareholders in Bryant and May, so this was not looking good. You know, the day job was caring about the poor, and then they were making huge profits off working people. They went back to work within 2 weeks. They won the right to form the largest union of women and girls in the country at the time. They won better pay, better conditions, and they massively influenced the dock strike that came a year later. But Labour historians tended to go, oh no, dock strike, that started it, that started the modern Labour movement. Now the dockers, however, they had a bit of a problem, do historians, because the dockers, if you read their accounts, the dockers' leaders were going, no, it was the match girls. They went on strike and they won, so we asked them to help us, and then we went on strike. But still, a lot of historians, I don't want to say male historians, don't seem to like the Matchwomen, just as their betters didn't like them. They're very rough. They're a rough set of girls, as Charles Booth called them. And how could they possibly have understood anything about politics? I mean, they hadn't read Marx cover to cover. They probably hadn't been to any meetings. How would they possibly understand that they were exploited? No one had told them yet. So what we do to make that bearable, we give the credit to Annie Besant, who was a middle-class journalist who wrote about the dispute, and we say that she led the strike, even though Annie Besant goes screaming through history, going, no, that's a stupid idea. I didn't want them to go on strike. But no, it's Annie Besant and the Match Girls strike. Don't believe a word of it. People have also said, well, could it possibly have been influential? How could, as one historian said, they were so unlike the other groups of workers that were the new trade unionists. How could they have influenced them? Well, they were unlike them in that they were all Irish. The Dockers were Irish, the Matchwomen were Irish. They were all Eastenders. They lived in the same streets and houses and families. They were related, but presumably they were unlike them because they were women. So how could they possibly have influenced anything? Unfortunately, history tells us, and when I was researching my book, I heard from the Derry Trades Council that actually their influence spread so fast and so far that some Derry shirt makers wrote to the Matchwomen's Union and said, oh, we've heard about this, right? We'd like to do the same. They sent Elenor Marx, went over to Derry and went to assist and help to organise them. So massively influential. And not only that, but during the dock strike, they took secondary action. We can't do that now. Oh, the nostalgia. And the reports of the dock strike's victory procession say there's this lovely image. Up came the match girls like a moving rainbow because they wore their big colourful hats and they wore their best dresses, which is a lovely idea of the strike demonstration. I think we should all do it. So there's a lot we can learn from the Matchwomen. Don't wait for somebody to come and say it's your turn now. Don't wait for somebody to hand you your power. Just take it, just do it, and absolutely stick up for yourselves and your sisters and brothers and for each other. That's pretty much it, apart from, if you're interested in the Matchwomen, they do have their own festival. And it's on the 4th of July in the East. I know you can all find the East End, so it's in Canning Town. And I think a key point, we will have a hat making workshop and we will also have our own beer. We'll have our own Matchwomen's beer, brewed by a woman. Thank you.
Now, and then after Siobhan, we'll open it up for some questions for the floor.
Yeah, hello. Andrea mentioned at the beginning that I've been sort of going around doing a few of these now, but it's especially nice to be in East London because, as some of you will know, I'm an East London girl myself. I'm from Newham. I normally get a bit of a nosebleed when I come this side of the boat. I'm all right tonight, I'm okay. But it's really lovely actually to be talking about the book, and especially with Louise tonight, because I think she's made such an important contribution to understanding the period of new unionism and really in the role of ordinary people in shaping their own history. And really I think that the period is a time that really speaks to the world that we find ourselves in today, a world in crisis, living in a city that has huge pockets of poverty, you know, under a government that wants to make workers pay for a crisis that we didn't create, huge gaps between rich and poor. So really what I wanted to do tonight and what I wanted to do in the book was draw out some of the things about Elenor Marx's life, about her activism that I really think linked to where we find ourselves today. And another reason why I wanted to write the book as well was because that book that Glyn had earlier on, the wonderful Yvonne Catt biography, which some people may have read, actually costs about £75 second hand now. So I thought it would be a good chance to flog this incredibly reasonably priced book for just £3. Anyway, I think recently actually a lot has been made of this idea about the so-called unorganisable, the idea that there are certain groups of people in society who can't fight back because of what their work looks like, you know, because of the fact that they're on 0 hours contracts or casual labour, whatever it is. But actually I think the period that Louise has written about, and which comes through I hope in the book as well, really shows a different example. Really it shows new unionism, that period that workers, so-called unorganisable workers, women workers, migrant workers. Louise talked about the strong links to the Irish community. Young workers could really fight back on a really huge and impressive scale. And I think too that the sort of life and activism of Elenor Marx, what else comes through from when I was writing the book, was really the links between the movements on the streets and the movements in the workplaces, and the importance of solidarity and building those two. And Elenor Marx was someone who stood on street corners at demonstrations. There's a fantastic account written by Clara Zetkin, the German socialist who founded International Working Women's Day, which we had just a few days ago, about her standing on a pub table standing on a pub, amazing. Standing on a pub table in a meeting in East London, speaking to women workers about how they could organise collectively. But actually often, a lot is made of Elenor Marx's personal life, her connections, you know, who her father was, Karl Marx, and actually that she deserves to be someone who should be celebrated and taken seriously. But also that contribution that was made by the men and women who she fought alongside for better pay, for improved conditions, to be able to organise and join a union. And I think that tradition as well is something that we should be very proud of, living in East London in particular. Now, Elenor Marx was born in 1855 in Soho. You can go to a very nice restaurant in Dean Street now and have a meal in a room called the Marx Room, which is the private room. Looks very lovely on the website. Sort of a strange sort of thing going on with sort of retaking these amazing places that belong in working class history and making them something else. You know, Louise was talking about the Beau Quarter, and she really grew up surrounded by very big political ideas. And her childhood was certainly incredibly stimulating in terms of, you know, socially and culturally and actually politically. And she began to develop her political interests very early on. During the American Civil War, she wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln to offer him her advice, and she said, "I felt absolutely convinced that Abraham Lincoln badly needed my advices to the war." She was 6 at the time, quite impressive, really. And at this point as well, you saw her develop a very important relationship, a lasting relationship with Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's closest friend and collaborator. And one of her very early interests was actually in the Irish struggle. You know, Louise was talking about the Irish community in the East End, and that was something that certainly held with Elenor Marx throughout her life. She talks about going to Manchester for what sounds like a wonderful day of radical sightseeing with Engels and his partner, Lizzie Burns. And she came back to London and she went to a demonstration in support of the Fenians, the Irish rebel group. She began research for a book on Ireland for Engels, and she read Irish newspapers, and she began to sign her letters Fenian Sister. And she started really to identify with some of the most oppressed in society at this point. And really this sort of internationalist outlook was something that held with her throughout her life. She was a fantastic linguist. She used this in all sorts of areas. She translated the plays of the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. For her, actually, the female characters in the Ibsen plays were incredibly interesting, and she wanted to share that work in that way. And she also used it in her activism. She organised amongst workers in Stepney who spoke Yiddish. They were recent migrants from Eastern Europe, and she used that in that way as well. And for her, actually, as too, her internationalism came through probably in the greatest inspiration for her was in the Paris Commune when she was 16. And the Commune only survived for 2 months, but really it was the most liberating government that the world has ever seen up until that point. And for Elenor Marx, one of the things that really inspired her about the Paris Commune was the role of women. She looked at Paris and saw that women were central to fighting for the Commune, but also that it transformed their lives. She saw that equal pay was introduced, that divorce rights were granted, that girls' education was promoted. And for her, she saw that women and men struggling together to forge this new society, and then when it was crushed, coming together to defend it was a huge, huge inspiration. And for her, really, actually, she started to build concrete solidarity back at home as well. In London, she coordinated the relief committee for communards, and she raised money for the refugees. And for years after this, she organised the Commune anniversary meetings, often which took place in East London, and she would always return to that question of women in the movement. And really that gave her a different sort of vision of what a socialist society could look like. And this was something that really held with her throughout the 1880s. In the book I call it the busiest decade, and it was certainly, I think Louise gave a bit of a flavour of what it was like in East London during that time. And you really see her emerging as a very dedicated activist and a writer. She begins to write quite extensively on the issue of women's liberation, for example. She writes a very impressive pamphlet on it. Louise talked about prostitution and that being a big question in society at the time. Actually, Elenor Marx came at it from a different angle to a lot of people. She came at it from a political one rather than a sort of moralistic angle, actually, and really recognised where that women's oppression came from. And for her, what you see in East London at this time, but also across the country, is really a combination of increasing poverty, a huge recession taking place, and a lack of representation for working class people that really shaped the decade in a big, big way. And Engels wrote of the majority of workers in London at this time, he wrote that they were living in an ever-spreading pool of misery and desolation, which I always think is a very evocative way of summing up the situation that workers were finding themselves in. But also when you think about the levels of child poverty in particular, you know, in this borough and so on, actually it sums up 2015 in a pretty good way as well. And really for decades you've seen that the working class and its organisations had been dormant, and actually that there wasn't very much going on at all. Louise talked about the fact that women had been on strike throughout the sort of preceding few decades, but actually you hadn't seen on the scale that we really needed to see. And Elenor Marx described a few years after the new unionism, she described how for years the political movement of workers as a class was if not dead, then at least in a profound sleep. And really you see that the 1880s is the re-emergence of working class political movements in a very big way. And really that explosion came in 1888 with the birth of the new unionism movement. And the Matchwomen strike in Bow just up the road. And I think you really can't underestimate the significance of the period at the time. Really it represents that birth of the trade union movement that Louise talked about. And actually it was a move away from organisation which focused very narrowly on certain small groups of workers. It wasn't seen as something for women workers, it wasn't seen as something for migrant workers or young workers or the so-called unskilled workers. I've got a bit of a problem with the term unskilled, because actually this was really hard work in lots of senses, but it wasn't seen as something for those people. And that example of the Matchwomen is actually one that for me was when I first was thinking about big ideas in the world when I was growing up in East London, was actually an incredibly exciting example. I think what Louise's book does is actually make it even more exciting. It sounds a lot more fun after reading Louise's book than it did before, but actually it's an incredibly inspiring example of that period. And it went from the Matchwomen to the Great Dock Strike, which is the thing that a lot of people know about when they think about this time, to the gas workers. And all that showed was that those people who had been patronised and vilified in equal measure really could fight back. And it's really some very inspiring times. Elenor Marx was spending lots of time in East London at this time, and she wrote some very vivid accounts of this really desperate situation that workers find themselves in. I mentioned at the beginning about the idea about them being so casual, their work being so casual that they couldn't organise, and she wrote about their work that down at the docks that the men fight and push and hustle like beasts, not men, to get work. Actually the bosses replaced the iron railings with wooden ones, although I still think if you got impaled by wooden railings that would hurt quite a lot, so that the workers would hurt themselves less when they were fighting themselves to get work. You're talking about really the most downtrodden people in society fighting back in a big way, and actually their work was so insecure that for so long they had been told that it wasn't possible for them to do anything about it. So really they're examples of fighting for better pay, for improved conditions. I was reminded today when I read Louise's book again about the Matchwomen getting their own canteen so that they could have their lunch without risk of getting phosphorus in their jaw after, phosphorus with your sandwich when you're eating your lunch. Actually, even those things that we might really take for granted in a big way were things that they fought for and won at this time. And you're talking about a movement on a huge, huge scale as well. You've got the big factories, the docks, the gasworks, and so on, but also workplaces all across East London. I mentioned the Jewish tailors just up in Stepney, quite small workshops actually, relatively, but they combined too and fought back. Some of you will know that my personal favourite, I'm from Manor Park in Newham, one of my personal favourites of the workers who fought back at this time were the onion peelers in East Ham. Forget bookmarks, I think the onion peelers as a Saturday job is pretty good really, perhaps, but they obviously didn't think so. But actually you're talking about it on a huge scale, not one big workplace in one place, but actually it was spreading all the way across East London in a huge, huge way. And women as well were involved all the way throughout. Elenor Marx played a very important role in helping to set up the Gas Workers and General Labourers Union, and she helped set up one of the first women's branches of the union, and she was unanimously elected, it should be said, to the executive at its first conference. And what she did was she argued very consistently that men and women needed to combine to improve their conditions. And women were very involved too in building solidarity in their communities. In Louise's book, she comes with a lovely example about young women workers supporting the dock strike on a demonstration, which was particularly musical. They come out singing and dancing and playing the mouth organ, and actually everyone else on the demonstration is going, oh, they're a bit noisy, aren't they? They're getting on their nerves a little bit, actually, these women who are coming out and showing solidarity. But actually one of my particularly favourite examples of women showing solidarity and building at this time was when they declared a rent strike on the commercial road in Shadwell, and they put a banner across the road which said this. It said, our husbands are on strike, for the wives it is not honey, and we all think it's not right to pay the landlord money. Everyone is on strike, so landlords don't be offended. The rent that's due will pay when the strike is ended. And I actually like to think that maybe they didn't pay it. We won't. But really, you know, housing crisis going on is quite a good example for our times, actually. But for Elenor Marx, really, the involvement of women in the strikes and in the movements was really of utmost importance, and she really wanted to convince them of her ideas, her socialist ideas, and she was involved in helping to organise the 1890 May Day demonstration. And she made a really wonderful speech, and this is probably one of my favourite quotes of her, actually, where actually she gets down to what she's trying to do here. And she says this: we must not be like some Christians who sin for 6 days and go to church on the 7th, but we must speak for the cause daily and make the men, and especially the women we meet, come into the ranks to help us. And I like that, actually. She's talking about it not just being about the, you know, perhaps smaller issues, like 8-hour day, although it's something that we often take for granted today, but actually thinking about a wider vision of what she wanted society to look like and communicating those ideas in a very impressive way. And really for her, bringing together men and women was the best way of fighting for women's liberation. And I think that legacy of bringing men and women together, but also migrant workers too, actually some wonderful examples of Matchwomen to the Jewish tailors all the way across Britain and East London of people combining, is a very inspiring time. You know, you think actually now we're living in coming up to an election period that's so dominated by racist scapegoating, and I hope that lots of people will be there on Saturday at the demonstration to show actually that that's not how we think that you fight austerity, but actually the fact that these workers came together at a time when they were subject to so much scapegoating and racism is something that's incredibly impressive. And I wanted to come to an example that was sort of emerging while I was writing the book, and that was the example of fast food workers in America that was coming through very clearly at the end of last year, and really that, you know, relationship between the industrial, if you like, and the political. Because you see in America the fact that young fast food workers are organising exactly the same things that actually people were organising for during the new unionism, the right to be in a union that's recognised for better pay and conditions and so on. But actually that's relating with a movement on the streets against police racism and brutality in a way that is potentially quite explosive. For me, Elenor Marx was someone who is just a really inspiring example of an activist, a writer, a socialist, but so too are all those other examples as well, the Matchwomen, the dockers, the gas workers, the onion peelers, and all of those people who fought back across East London and across Britain. And for us, I think today, building against austerity and against cuts in whatever way we can, actually, those examples are incredibly relevant ones to us today and very inspiring ones too.
Some questions or some comments that people might like to take. What I'll do is, if I see a couple of hands, I might take 2 or 3 before I ask the speakers to come back, so we just don't do a sort of a to and fro too much. So if you want to say something, if you could stick your hand up and give me an idea. Yep. Right, back in the purple and then in front with the stripes.
I work for Hamlets and I'm a youth activist, and I went to the National Youth and Women's Conference recently, and it was an interesting conference, and actually there was a lot of discussion about how much harder things are getting for women actually, because you've got this sort of double thing of both, you know, austerity sort of, you know, having the effects it has on the entire working class in terms of reducing living standards. But actually, it's more than that for women, who, because society still expects us to be the main carers and to take responsibility for sort of elderly relatives and what have you, then we're sort of more affected as well by all the cuts in services. So it's not just as workers, but actually as users of services. And so on. And obviously there was a lot of discussion as well about domestic violence. There was some discussion about you know, the sort of kind of the new sexism on university campuses, where with lap dancing and all these awful things that would have been unthinkable when I was at college. But I think one of the things that we tried to raise was actually, it's important that we don't just talk about women as victims, but we talk about women as fighters. And I think these kind of examples are fantastic. And it's both about the kind of women leaders like that people might have heard about, like Elenor Marx, but also the women fighting back collectively. And you know, the Matchwomen, some of them were very young as well. And it's incredible the potential that it shows. And the fact that women have such a long history of struggle and collective struggle, going back to the Paris Commune, the Chartists and what have you. And I think, you know, we really need to bring this into our movement and make sure that women are aware, and that because it's inspiring and it gives you confidence. And actually, you know, we need to talk about ourselves as fighters a bit more than we do, I think.
Thank you.
Just a question, how did Elenor Marx and others organise, and how might that be relevant or translate to organising on a mass scale today?
I can take a couple more at this point. Or if you need time to think, then I'll have to ask Siobhan and Louise. Oh yeah.
Well, I just want to talk a little bit about a strike which is happening at the moment, which is being led by a woman activist, Candy Udwin. The National Gallery, which we fund, you know, through our taxes, the management there have decided that they want to privatise the workforce, which means that instead of them being employed directly, they'll become contracted out to a company. And we all know what that means, because we're all surrounded by, you know, wherever you work, you see it happening. It means you get insecurity of contract, you get less pay. There's the whole thing about what happens to the pensions and all that kind of thing. And so far, for one exhibition, they've spent £500,000 to bring in a private company to curate the Sainsbury Wing exhibition at the moment. They have. Candy, because I was talking about it with her today, she's estimated they've spent £1 million so far in strike breaking, because Candy's an amazing activist. She's one of these people, she organised over stuff in the Middlesex going up about 20 years, and she's been, you know, organising, this time it's a civil service union. And there was, the reason I wanted to talk about it today is, she said, I happened to get an email through from the National Gallery about, because they've got a new director appointed who's coming over from Spain, he's an assistant director of the Prado, and so I rang up to find out what the state of the strike is. And they're going to be out on strike again next week, because they've taken 2 days action and 3 days action, and now they're going to be taking, I think, 5 days action. And they're going to have a demonstration next Thursday. So anybody who can go down there to the National Gallery, everybody knows where it is, Trafalgar Square. They want the maximum number of people to turn out to that, but also, because the last one I went to was pouring rain. But it was a really lively rally, and what was really good about it was the report back of people who were doing all sorts of little demonstrations of support. They either sent in, you know, a group of people, they did a selfie of a group of people in work who, supporting the strikers, and there was loads and loads of messages pouring in to this, you know, we were being drenched, you know, down at this solidarity demonstration, so people could think about doing, you know, getting a group of union members together in work, or a group of people that you work with, and then sending it to the strikers. You can go onto the website, the PCS website. It's that kind of solidarity which they're going to need if they're going to win it, because then it will have a real knock-on effect on museum workers and art gallery workers right across the country.
What time's the demo?
I'll have to check. I'll send you a text. The last one was midday. I suspect it'll be midday so people can go in their lunch hour.
We might find out before the end of the meeting tonight. What I'll do is I'll ask Siobhan and Louise to come back to some of those points, and I'll take it back out to you again. And feel free to ask short questions or to talk about things that you've been doing at work or in your colleges, or local examples or whatever, anything you want to talk about. But if I could just get Louise and Siobhan just to comment on those points.
Yeah, the Unison sister, absolutely right, that it's so important that we have these examples for girls and women in schools today, and we don't, and it's very deliberate that we don't. As somebody very clever said, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And we know that it's particularly true for black people, for Asian people. They're so excluded from British history. We saw Michael Gove absolutely attack any kind of inclusiveness in history and try to revert back to, Henry VIII, Churchill, we're done, basically. We don't want anybody who's not white. And David Starkey, it's like actually said about a year ago, the history of the world until about 5 minutes ago is white European men. And to suggest otherwise is a nonsense. Well, that's a nonsense, Mr. Starkey. That is absolute crap. It's been hidden. It's been deliberately hidden from us because they know these examples are so powerful. They know what it's like if you grow up as a girl and you've got these incredible examples of migrant workers, of teenage migrant workers, so looked down upon, so spat upon, changing the world. It's incredibly strong. And I go into schools, don't tell Nicky Morgan, but I do, and I love going into schools and getting this message across. And the kids are bored out of their minds, but they love it. They absolutely love the fact that kids their age were doing this, were changing the world. They're not giving that message enough, and you're absolutely right, it is completely key.
To come to the question about how Elenor Marx and others organised and how we can sort of translate it to today, I think actually you recognise from the period the amount of really patient work that went into it, a lot of the organising that Elenor Marx and other socialists in East London and across the country really put into it. For years they were building very deep connections with people who were working class militants up and down the country. Elenor Marx, for example, had quite a long lasting relationship with Will Thorne, who went on to be one of the leaders of the Gas Workers Union. She actually taught Will Thorne to read and write because she recognised that that sort of ability that she had was something that was quite crucial to him being able to communicate in a more effective way with people who he was involved in. But I think really the way that they organise, I suppose the thread that runs through it is the importance of solidarity and building those links, because they would, for example, build a demonstration on the streets around the issue of a lot of what it was around actually was around organising, for example, and the right for socialists to organise. So on the streets, in particular in places around here like Limehouse and so on, actually making those connections between groups of workers who were otherwise, around in that way. I think something that comes through in Louise's book as well is the importance of those sort of community connections that actually, these often it's seen as, so it's not that inspiring example, these groups of workers are seen as quite separate often by historians or commentators. Actually they had huge connections to one another, and the role of socialists often was about emphasising those links between groups of workers, be it between women workers and men workers, or migrant workers and British workers, whatever it was. But actually that was quite a crucial part, and I think that is something I'm really glad that Sheila mentioned the National Gallery strike and the importance of solidarity today, because actually it can feel often that we've got little sparks of resistance going on, but actually there's not something pulling it all together necessarily, and that the importance of solidarity is that it can give people confidence in making them feel like they can fight back in that way. I wanted to just come to something that the comrade from Unison talked about, and she talked about the new sexism. Actually, often the new sexism doesn't feel all that new. It's still so horribly sexist. But actually, how do women see their potential to change the world? Actually, in the society that we live in, they see that potential in the way that they look often. Actually, these examples mean that there are other things to point to which say that women are much more than actually what we look like, and whether you can pole dance or whether your skirt is too short or not short enough or whatever it is. Actually, these give an alternative to say that actually that's where power really lies, is not in the way that society tells you that women are strong, but actually in a very alternative way that these important examples can really show in that sense.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad that Siobhan mentioned Will Thorne as well, because not only do we have Siobhan's book here and Louise's book here, we also have a book on Will Thorne at the back, so we always come prepared as bookmarks. I've also been given some information about the day of action outside the National Gallery. So the rally is going to be Thursday the 26th of March at 1 p.m. outside the National Gallery, but there's strikes that week every day from the 24th to the 28th. So they'll be meeting every morning from 9 to 11 in the morning as well outside the National Gallery. And Friday evening, which is the 27th of March, there'll also be a special evening rally as well at 5 p.m. till 6:30. So there's lots of ways to get involved. And if you want to find out more, you can look on the PCS website. The PCS is the union involved, and they've got all the details of that on their website. So I can take some more questions or some more comments. Yeah, I've got two. Oh, I've got lots of hands going. And I don't often get to say this, but actually men are allowed to speak as well. I've got two women at first, back, woman there, then Robbie, and then at the back. Yeah.
So, I just wanted to say, I'm really shameless promotion process as well. I'm talking about the NHS that we're having tomorrow down in Limehouse about saving our local surgeries. And I'm really thinking these sort of things we can talk about on the platform. NHS, where in the times that Siobhan and Louise have been talking about, working women, not working, sorry, women were not covered by the health service. Any sort of health sort of service was provided came from the man's work, and he was covered, but his wife and his children wouldn't have been. So really, for working class women, if they became ill, the only recourse they had really was to go to the workhouse, and we all know how dreadful those sorts of places were. So, you know, we fought really hard, or our predecessors fought really hard to get the NHS, which we then had in 1948. But now it's been eroded, it's been privatised, it's been broken up, it's been fragmented, and what's happening across the country is that our GP surgeries are now under threat. So in Tower Hamlets, in true style, we've got Maggie and Candice and lots of people in this room who are campaigning hard to keep our surgeries going, and Limehouse surgery is under threat. So we're having a protest tomorrow at 2 o'clock on the big traffic island at the bottom of Burdett Road. I'm going to pass some leaflets around. If anybody's free or you know anybody who can come, that'd be brilliant. And if there are enough of us, we know what we can do with roads, don't we? So pass them around.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, just a question really. What was the attitude of the forces of the state to the strike? I mean, the police. And was there sexism evident there? Because I would have thought that they were probably used to dealing with the Irish dockers, if you like. But, you know, I was just interested in it. And I just wondered, while I was speaking, I wanted people to know about another fantastically inspiring women not as victims, but they are victims, but they're not portraying themselves as victims. If people get a chance to see a film called We Are the Giant, it's about the Middle East, it's about Syria, and it's also about Bahrain. And there's a fantastic woman activist. She's living in Denmark, but she does come here. She came to a conference 2 weeks ago. And in the film of We Are the Giant, her sister is seen standing there with the forces of the state in their might. And there she is in her, you know, full hijab, and she is just standing like this. She's just standing there in the face of vicious stuff going on around her. This is a woman who's now been to prison 3 times at least and is on her way again. She has appeared, and I know it's not about individuals, of course it's not. And in fact, the message I want to say is about solidarity, because that's what the other sister is doing here. She can't go to Bahrain, she'll also go inside. But she is raising solidarity. So just, you know, the MENA, Middle East North African Solidarity Network, there are things on there which are truly inspiring and truly in need of our solidarity.
Thank you very much.
I'm afraid I'm not going to plug a book. I just wanted to make a point, tell an anecdote and make a point. I go to a new sixth form college in East London, a huge comprehensive sixth form college, and the college is really great at celebrating, LGBT week, UN Anti-Racist Day, Women's Day, week, I'm not sure. International Day, isn't it? Yeah. International Women's Day. And I realised today on the way in that our display for International Women's Day, which is sort of a display of inspirational women, and I noticed someone who was on there. Margaret Thatcher was on there. Yeah. I mean, she's not on there now, she's now in the bin. But it just sort of strengthens and made me think about this meeting actually, because it shows us how much we need to focus on the history of women's struggle, women's working class women's struggle, to focus on the idea that, so I brought this up with some of my friends in my history class afterwards, and they sort of said, oh no, but it's supposed to be inspiring. And we need to, so we really need to focus on the history of women's struggle, show that the answer is in solidarity and not in sort of individualistic ambition.
Sure there's no book in there, Robbie?
I was really glad Louise talked about that people like Starkey or Michael Gove or Nicky Morgan and a whole layer of people like that deliberately want to hide the history that we owe a debt to Louise, Siobhan and many others for uncovering. They want to bury that history for a reason. It's not because they just don't like it, it's because they want us to look at history and just think history and what's changed in the past is all the acts of people at the top of society. It was Henry VIII who did something or somebody like that. They don't want the Matchwomen strike did change things in Britain. The dog strike that we've heard about did change things, and those were part and parcel of giving us the modern trade union movement. Elenor Marx and the people around her did change things. All sorts of things came out of that period. Down at the bottom of Burdett Road, Dodge Street, in an unassuming little place with a little civil service office on now, used to be the Dole office down there. Elenor Marx was there with William Morris, winning the right, establishing the right to go out on the streets without pay tables, selling newspapers. That didn't come from nowhere. That came a few hundred yards down the road on Dodge Street in East London in the 19th century. That right was established by people not that different to us actually. You can go right through, we talk about the fight against racism. Cable Street, just down the road, where we did stop Mosley and his black shirts, a tradition that continued through the 1970s in East London, the 1990s with Beacon, and more recently when people like this Lynn was the chair, was in here earlier, was the chair of United East End, when we successfully stopped the EDL marching in Tower Hamlets, and that broke the wave of the EDL and threw them backwards. So real victories achieved. We talk about women. I went to see a few weeks ago the fantastic musical about Maidy and Dagenham, another group of women workers, not in the more recent past, who also took strike action, which did change things in this country. And that history is something we need to look at and learn from and uncover, and real debt of gratitude to those people who've gone away and done the work to uncover it for us. But we need to see it as a tool to say to the Morgans, the Goves, to the David Starkeys, we've changed the world once, we're going to learn from our own history, and we're going to change the world today. And the point about understanding the past is to use it as a weapon in the fight to change the world around us today.
I've got some at the front.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise the question about ideas, because it strikes me we are all here not just because Elenor Marx was some woman who used to do things in the East End, but because there's something about radical ideas and how it combines to make real change that people are really looking for at the moment. And it always strikes me when you read about the Matchwomen that it really, what a lot of commentators and historians have been trying to do is to work out where did these women get these ideas from. And that part of that, it must have been some outsider, it must have been some educated person came and told them, is partly a belittling of women's own capacity to work out I work for God knows how many hours, I come away with nothing and they seem to make a lot of money. There's something wrong going on here. But the element, and I think, you know, lots of us could replicate that in lots of places. You don't need to tell people who work in Starbucks and McDonald's who's making money and who's getting shafted. But then there's the other bit of it, which is about confidence to act. And to me, that's where the political tradition, you know, standing in a political tradition, which I don't think Elenor Marx necessarily believed everything her dad said, like none of us do, but there was a political body of ideas and knowledge and a connection to international struggle, which she was part of, and which she managed to, and others like her, by the discussions and the meetings like this. This is really my point, I suppose. You don't think that this is part of changing the world, but selling newspapers and leafleting hospitals and sitting in little meetings and organising at work with confidence around clear ideas about how to change the world is part of that process. That's what I think. But I'm making a link of saying I'm confident that was part, because everybody wants to say the Matchwomen got it from outside, but I'm presuming there were Matchwomen who sat around the fire with their families arguing about the post-commune and all the rest of it.
Thank you. I'll take a couple more points or questions if anyone's got something they'd like to say before I ask Louise and Siobhan to sum up and answer the questions and the comments that we've had so far. If anyone else still has a burning point they'd like to say, yeah?
Just following on from Eileen, and maybe when Siobhan was talking about the fight for the 8-hour day, and it made me think of that like the Bryant sketch on 8-hour day luxury, because as nurses we you know, and I'm a student nurse, and as nurses we work 12.5-hour shifts, often without breaks, going home 2 hours or unpaid without, you know, after our shift, exhausted, demoralised, vilified by the press, as that phrase used, vilified and patronised, and that's the way we felt. And then yesterday, activists have been arguing for years that in order to pay for this PFI monstrosity, we've had our wages cut, we've had our pensions attacked, we've been down banded, and we're paying for the price to line the pockets of those people who effectively live in the building. So just to emphasise, or to add on to what Eileen was saying, come to the hospital with your leaflets, agitate and organise with the nurses, because I think actually nurses, largely immigrant, you know, there's a Filipino, African, now increasingly Spanish, Portuguese, women workers have the potential to go on the streets and to strike and to bring down the government. Actually, nurses on the streets have that power potentially. So organise and come and agitate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, if everyone's happy with the floor, I'll ask the speakers to come back. I just want to mention first of all just a couple of things. I think some people are going to go for a drink afterwards to the Good Samaritan, which is on Stepney Way. Just to remind people as well about the Matchwomen's Festival. There are leaflets here, you can pick them up. There's stuff on Facebook, there'll be a website, so you can get lots of information, but please come and get one of those from Siobhan. Everyone on their seat, from Louise, everyone on their seat, well, Siobhan's speaking, Siobhan's speaking, she might do it. Everyone's got leaflets for the anti-racist demo on Saturday on their seats, and there's also information about the next couple of events in Bookmarks in the bookshop. Our next events are back in the shop, which is in Bloomsbury, just around the corner from the TUC. But we have two events next week. We've got Peter Haynes speaking, the Labour MP, on Monday about Back to the Future of Socialism, which is his new book. And then on Wednesday we've got a great event with David Rosenberg, who's speaking on Rebel Footprints, a guide to uncovering radical London, and he's going to be talking about the suffragettes and the Chartists and talking about the history. So it's sort of an antidote to some of these dreadful walking tours that have been available. So that'll be a lovely event, and we'll be happy to see any of you if you'd like to come along on Monday or Wednesday next week. So I'll ask Louise to come back first, and then I'll ask Siobhan to come and sum up.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about ideas and where these ideas come from. Because even when I was doing my research, I was talking to other academics and to historians and going to archives, there was so much pushback and resistance to the idea that the matchwomen could have been political. Well, when you say political, I mean, obviously you mean in a sort of rough-hewn working class. No, I mean political, whatever you want to call it. And in fact, that there's a lot of disrespect to the Irish traditions of defiance, which are incredibly strong. And I was told that I was romanticising the Irish. And oh goodness, I was banned from one archive effectively because the director was so annoyed that I was writing about the matchwomen. He refused to let me look at his archive. Because he said, well, I was made to do a master's degree about the matchwomen. It's all nonsense. They absolutely achieved nothing. It's all a load of nonsense. You know, there's nothing in the archives that could possibly relate to them. And you know, that wasn't that long ago. It's fascinating. But I had a little word. And I said, but look at the Irish. You know, I had to use a lot of disparate sources for this and unpublished memoirs and people's anecdotes and people's memories of their childhood. But you've got an entire country that knows its history so well, that's talked about. One bloke talked about, we used to sit around the fireside and okay, we couldn't read and write, didn't matter, we would tell our tales of errings, wrongs, and we all knew the stories, and we all knew about our martyrs, and we all knew about our heroes and our heroines, and it was passed on from father to son. You did not need the middle class to come and tell you. In fact, they were telling, I would argue that the Irish, this very, very radical community in London, are educating everybody else. Everyone's catching up with them. And they're having huge demonstrations on Home Rule, on Irish affairs. Hundreds of thousands of people are marching from working class areas. This is not being organised by the Fadians or the middle classes. And when the matchwomen strike, I'd argue that they immediately walk out, they picket. They would have been expected to, well, they've got no trade union, they won't know what to do, bless them, they'll probably go down the pub or something. No, they picket immediately, they elect a committee, they go back in, they have their demands, they widen their demands immediately, they're really organised. And in fact, they've gone on strike loads of times before. And women, there was a huge strike in 1788 of hand spinners in Leicester, all female union. This has always happened, and it's not come from the middle class downwards. And when they're on strike, you see the middle class socialists, bless them, desperately running to catch up. Right now, what do we do? Oh, and Annie Besant tries to make them go back. And somebody bringing in the point about the police, which somebody mentioned as well. Annie Besant is desperately trying to get the matchwomen back to work. They will go back to work. She's writing in a paper, don't, it's all right, they've just made a bit of a mistake. They've got confused. They'll go back to work, they will. And it's local police who say to a local paper, they won't, you know, we know them. You must be joking. If anybody breaks that strike, good luck to them, because we know it's policemen. I mean, it was an East End tradition, there wasn't much on telly, obviously, in those days. They used to lure policemen, remember in the streets it would all be very dark, they'd lure them down little alleyways and they'd lift up the manhole cover, policeman falls in, manhole cover back on top. This is your nightly entertainment. They weren't the most respectful, kind of, you know, there wasn't a lot of deference going on, quite frankly. And the police said about the Fenian barracks, they wouldn't go there. If you had to arrest somebody and they said, right officer, go and arrest, where are they, what address, no. No, you're fine, I'm not going. And if you tried to, they'd barricade the area and they would, men and women, throw everything they could get their hands on, slops, potties, you name it, chairs, everything would be thrown at the police until they backed off, which the middle classes didn't like. I call it solidarity myself. There you go. These are not people who need educating about politics. They completely understand it, they understand it from childhood. And it is the middle class socialists who are dragged along with them, believing that they only can organise the revolution, and then they get a bit of a surprise, they get a bit of a kick in the pants, really, from the matchwomen.
Louise has stolen all the good stories about the police. Well, I did have one, but it's not as good as yours. So I'm deaf now. Tell it anyway. I wanted to come to the comrade at the back who spoke about, you know, recently celebrating International Women's Day, because actually International Women's Day is International Working Women's Day, which is often conveniently forgotten when people talk about it. I mean, that's just one such example. I was I was invited to a networking breakfast to celebrate International Women's Day with the head of HR for a multinational, which quite frankly, I would rather gouge my eyes out with spoons than go to that. But you know, I didn't know, I know. But actually, to celebrate women in business and in commerce and women sacking people and all of that sort of thing, all those wonderful things that women do. Actually, that's not what International Women's Day is about. International Working Women's Day is about, and I think that the examples we've talked about tonight are actually what that tradition is. And I think the comrade at the back as well, who spoke about why they want us to forget these and conveniently forget them. So actually, you can't take those examples of people on your doorstep fighting back in a huge and really impressive way. Louise talked about the sort of Irish community and the thought of ideas, and, you know, how ideas change. And I think, you know, quite rightly, we celebrate now multicultural London and multicultural East London and all that migrant workers bring to our communities. But the other thing that migrant workers also bring are ideas and struggle. And there was a fantastic sort of report on the London bus strike from a few weeks ago, which basically shows, you know, that working class in London and in East London is from all around the world. There's someone from every country in the world living in London, and actually that's a massive contribution, not just to our culture, but actually also to our struggle and the way that ideas change. And I think, you know, we've got such a strong tradition in East London of those, some wonderful examples recently of fighting back the UDL, of campaigns going on, you know, around the NHS and so on. Auntie gave a fantastic example of nurses working at the Royal London just across the road. The fact actually that the working class changes, and actually that brings that potential for ideas to change in a very impressive way, and in an explosive way as well, in the way that we saw in the examples that we picked out tonight. So really, lastly, I would just say to people, if you're not thinking about coming along to the demonstration on Saturday, please do, because actually we're living in a society where migrants are being constantly attacked and being blamed for in society. Actually, it was exactly the same in the time that the Matchwomen and Elenor Marx and so on organised. Actually, the blame is not with those, it's with the people at the top who really should be blamed for that. And these are examples, I hope, that we've drawn out today, really, that show us where the way forward is in that sense.